I'd like to begin by asking us to just dwell on this idea of glory a little bit. Some of you might know, maybe you don't know, but I developed this little hobby on the side in the summer times with what's called woodworking. Okay, and just a garage summer kind of thing. Don't do it in the winter, too cold. But in the summertime, whenever there's free time, I try to do a little woodworking. And in our house, if you come over, we have in our living room this long coffee shop style table with like two seats, and you look out at the windows. It's quite a piece of work. you know I made it. I made it. And so here's a little picture of it when it was in production process. And when I made this, I'd lacked skills, okay, and I was just learning. But there's something about making an item or object with your own hands that it's just different from if you buy it. For example, to hold up my iPad here, I made this piece of wood block. I made this. Like it is so smooth. It's like glass. It's so smooth. You know how many hours I sanded this thing to get it like this? Just to hold up my iPad. And so, but something about it, like if I get discouraged preaching, I just like touch it and it's so smooth. I feel like, wow, I made it with my own hands. And there's something about that. Why? Because I put myself into it. I put my time, my care. I invested, and there's something different about it. When you look at a table like this, there are lots of imperfections because I didn't really know what I was doing. And so I know where to look to find those imperfections. And if you look really closely, you can find where things are uneven and I didn't sand and plane properly. You can find all those things if you look closely enough. Well, I kind of think like when He creates us, it's kind of the similar thing. When I create this table, it's imperfect, but it's part of me because I made it. But when God creates us, there is no imperfection. God created us in His own image. He created everything in all creation, of course, but when He created us to be like Him, to share His likeness. We are created glorious. Have you ever thought about that? We were created as glorious beings. But the problem is that in the Garden of Eden, we lost that glory. We lost all the benefits of that glory. We were meant to be glorious, but we lost it. And so I'd like us to think about this idea of glory because we really, if you think about it, we're each on a search for that glory again in our life. Glory that satisfies. Glory that tells you why you live on this earth. Glory that gives you meaning. Glory that gives you identity. We're searching and we're looking for that. And so today we want to think about this idea of how we were created with that glory. We lost that glory. We're searching for that glory. And we will find that glory again. So keep that in mind as we get started. We're going through the book of Mark, as you know. We've been skipping through, and we're going to start out with this little quote to get us started. Coming shortly after Jesus' first passion prediction and his teaching concerning the suffering path of true discipleship, the transfiguration provides confirmation and reassurance for Jesus' disciples that he is indeed the Messiah and the Son of God, God's agent of salvation, and that he will be vindicated and glorified after his suffering. The event also sets the stage for the climax of Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem. Jesus consults with Elijah and Moses, two great Old Testament prophets and leaders, as he prepares to head towards Jerusalem to accomplish his messianic task. So at this point in the book of Mark, we are getting ready to transition towards Jerusalem where Jesus will die on the cross and be resurrected. And that's why in preparation for our Easter season, we're actually going to jump ahead a little bit. We're skipping chapter 8. We're going to jump ahead here in chapter 9 as we're transitioning towards Passion Week as we journey with Jesus to the cross. Okay? Another thing to keep in mind as we get started is it's helpful and important to think about Jesus in relation to Moses. If you think about Jesus and Moses, Jesus went up to the mountain in this passage. In Exodus, Moses, he went up to the mountain to speak with God, and he came down with 10 commandments. Jesus, in this passage, is transfigured. His clothes become radiant white, as we'll talk about. In Exodus, Moses comes down, and his face is shining in radiance. God appears to both Jesus and Moses in the clouds. God speaks to both Jesus and Moses through the clouds. God speaks in both passages. When Jesus comes down, people are astonished. When Moses comes down, people are afraid, as we'll discuss. So as we look at this passage, we're going to talk about four things. First of all, we'll talk about person of glory. Second, we'll talk about prophets of glory. Third, we'll talk about portrayals of glory. Fourth, we'll talk about people of glory. Now, if you're stressing out because there's 4 points today, don't worry. They're all short, simple points. Okay? Person, prophets, portrayals, and people. All right, so let's talk about person of glory. Look at verse 2. And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. And his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. Now, throughout the Gospels, you'll find that increasingly what happens is, as Jesus gets closer and closer to his death, Jesus spends less time with people publicly. It's very interesting because you would think that Jesus would go on a preaching crusade to tell everyone, but he actually withdraws from the crowds. And he spends more and more private moments with his disciples because he's investing into them because they're going to carry forth the work. So this is one of those private moments with his guys, discipleship. And Peter, James, and John, amongst the disciples, they are sort of the inner core. And so they go hiking together and go up a mountain, as verse 2 specifies. And it's at the top of this mountain that they witness what could only be described as a total miracle, as Jesus is transfigured before them. Now, what in the world does it mean that Jesus was transfigured? Well, the word for transfigured, it's the same word that we get the word metamorphosis from. Okay? Metamorphosis, maybe like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, change, transformation. So I think Mark here is doing his best to describe what really cannot be described with words. Remember, he interviewed Peter, he interviewed other people, he did qualitative research, he found out what happened, he's writing a written account, and he's doing his best to describe what they saw that day. And it says here that Jesus' clothes became radiant. It says intensely white. I think what's going on here is there's no human words to describe the white here. He's using this laundry illustration saying no one on earth could bleach them. It's like there's no white in this world to describe the white that they saw. It was whiter than white. When you look at Luke, he says, appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. They're just searching for words, indescribable. Matthew, he says, his face shone like the sun, like the sun. Think about that comparison. And his clothes became white as light. So I think one way we can think about this transfiguration is to think about there is something not earthly going on here. There is something that Jesus is revealing about himself, who he really is, stepping out of his humanity so that his white, glorious radiance can be shown here. His true self, his true identity. So what is being revealed is Jesus as he really is in his unveiled glory. Now, that word glory is important. As we think about revealing his glory, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word for glory was used about 200 times. In the New Testament, the Greek word for glory was used about 168 times. So the idea of glory is this idea of weightiness, of worthiness, of heaviness, of magnitude, We say things like, that's a very heavy topic. It's the idea of glory. Or that's not a light issue, is it? It's the idea of glory. It's heaviness, weightiness. So glory is something that impacts you. It's so weighty. It makes you stand there in awe like you're seeing glorious snow-covered mountains. It makes you just your jaw drops because you're just in awe and wonder at what you see. That's what glory is like. And so these disciples here are seeing the glorious person who created the universe, who is bigger than the universe, who is greater than the universe. These disciples in this transfiguration moment are seeing something so glorious. They are seeing a glimpse of who Jesus really is. I tried to think about just a simple way to illustrate this. Recently, our daughter Karis had a birthday party. It was a pajama birthday party. And so Karis loves this pajamas that's a dog costume. She wears this all the time. And so her birthday party was pajamas with dog costume. So when Karis roams around the house, we don't tell this to too many people, but she loves acting like a dog. And so she crawls around, and I'll say, Karis, you want some ice cream? She's like a little puppy, and she loves acting like that. Now, she acts like a dog. She might look like a dog in this costume, but as much as she pretends, we know that whenever she unzips that costume, what comes out? Not a dog, fully human being Karis comes out. In a similar kind of way, this is what Jesus is doing. I think here in this transfiguration, he is unzipping the human flesh, and underneath that is his glorious radiance that is himself. That's him. And that's what these authors are getting a glimpse of, and they're trying to describe. So this is simply Jesus, not in the flesh, but this is Jesus in his glory, who he really is coming out. So we have to remember who this Jesus, who this person of glory is. So first we saw that. Now secondly, we're going to take this further and we're going to talk about prophets of glory. Look at verse 4 and verse 7. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses. And they were talking with Jesus. Verse 7. And a cloud, just picture this scene, and a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out from the cloud, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." And suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus only. So as Jesus is shining his radiant glory, what happens? You're Peter, James, and John. You're watching this. Jesus is shining. Your jaws drop. You're looking at this. You're in awe. And then suddenly, like characters in a video game or something, Moses and Elijah appear in the scene. And they're talking with Jesus. Can you imagine this moment? Peter always says foolish things. So he's probably like, dude, John, check it out. Do you think I could take a selfie with Mo over there? And he's getting all excited. This is an amazing scene here. Now, we aren't sure why God chose Elijah and Moses to appear in this transfiguration. Some people suggest that it might be because they represent the Old Testament law and the prophets. It might be because Elijah and Moses were both prophets who lived their entire lives pointing forward to Jesus. But definitely these are Old Testament saints who lived their lives waiting and waiting for God's promises to be fulfilled in the coming Messiah, who is Jesus. When Luke writes, he actually includes a detail that Mark leaves out here. He talks about how Moses, Elijah, and Jesus, what were they talking about? They were talking about how pretty soon Jesus is going to leave this world. And they were talking about how that was going to work out. That was the content of their conversation. So the disciples are seeing this and they're hearing this. Now think to yourself, why are they being shown this? Why did Jesus take them on the mountain to see this? Well, this scene is, I think, a representation of the Old Testament connecting to Jesus, the Old Testament that is pointing forward to Jesus. This is a picture of God's covenant grace being fulfilled as Christ will soon go to the cross. So remember, Jesus here is investing into discipling and preparing these guys, and he's showing them the story of God's love for humanity. And he's showing them this. Now look what happens in verse 7. Remember Peter? He just blabbers on foolishly. He's talking nonsensically about how they should build tents and shelters for them. And then Peter gets interrupted by God. You get interrupted by God, you got problems. Peter gets interrupted by God before he says something more foolish. God speaks from the clouds saying, this, can you just, clouds open up. This is my beloved son. Listen to him. Here's this powerful moment. William Lane describes, when Jesus began his mission in the wilderness of Judea, the voice of God declared him to be the beloved Son, the object of his elective pleasure. Now, on the wilderness mountain, the voice is heard again, reaffirming the Father's approval and confirming Jesus' dignity as the transcendent Son. So God here is putting all the spotlight on Jesus. Remember when Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist? The clouds opened up. God said, this is my son. The spotlight of heaven was on Jesus. All the focus was on Jesus. And now here, Jesus is at the end of his ministry, nearing the end of his mission. And God the Father is once again putting all the spotlight on Jesus, saying, this is my son. Listen to him. And he's reaffirming who Jesus is. Now, can you imagine the impact for these disciples? I think about John here. I think about him watching this scene. And he's seeing and hearing God the Father open up the clouds and say, this is my son. And that's why I think in John's mind, he never forgot that moment. And that's why he later will write in John chapter 3, verse 16, he'll say, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that who believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. So John saw God the Father praising and putting the spotlight on Jesus. It was Jesus alone. Notice how Moses and Elijah have quietly faded into the background. At the end of verse 7, it says that only Jesus remains. That's important. William Lane goes on to say, when the cloud lifted, Moses and Elijah had vanished. Jesus alone remained as the sole bearer of God's new revelation to be disclosed in the cross and resurrection. Moses and Elijah had followed the path of obedience, but having borne witness to Jesus' character and mission, they can help him no more. The way to the cross demanded the submission of the Son, and Jesus must set out alone. He must set out upon it alone. They've done their job. Their calling as prophets was to point to Jesus. Hey, Jesus is coming. Everybody, Jesus is coming. You got to repent. You got to believe. You got to trust him. Hey, Jesus is coming. That was their calling. But now what is happening in this transfiguration? These disciples are seeing that they fulfilled their calling. Their job is done. Jesus takes it from here, and that's why they fade into the background. I love how these prophets were like these arrows pointing to Jesus, but when they were done, what do? They fade out of the scene. They leave Jesus on the stage under the spotlights all by himself. I mean, they were phenomenal prophets. They were men of God, powerfully used, but they faded out of the scene. I think there's an important application here. in the same way, if you think about it, we are like prophets. We are like a prophetic voice in this world. And our job is to say, hey, look at Jesus who came. They said, look at Jesus who's coming. Our job is to say, hey, look at Jesus who came. You got to trust him. You got to believe in him. You got to worship him. And our job is to let people know that. Our job is to fulfill our calling. But in the same way, just like those prophets, Moses and Elijah here, our job is to fade away. Our job is to let Jesus be the one under the spotlights. Our job is to let Jesus be the one recognized. You know, that's a big struggle for many of us, myself included. Because a lot of times, we serve, maybe we lead a small group, family group, community group, whatever it's called in different places. Maybe we do some kind of ministry, and we like it when people affirm us, and we like it when people recognize us. And I'm not saying that's completely bad. There's some of that necessary. But many times what the problem is that we kind of shove Jesus out of the way and we like to be in the spotlight. Look at me. Look at how I'm serving. Look at my sacrifice. Look at me going to Haiti. Look at me doing this. And look at me cleaning up. And we love to be under the spotlight sometimes. And the problem is Jesus gets pushed to the shadows. I think what we learn here is that we are a prophetic voice, but our calling is to point people to Jesus and then to fade away so that he is the one praised, he is the one glorified, he is the one lifted up. We can ask ourselves, how many times have I stolen the spotlight from Jesus? How many times have I tried to draw attention to myself rather than pointing people to Jesus? And there's some great lessons here. So first we saw the person of glory. Second, we saw the prophets of glory. Third, what we want to do is we want to just look at two portrayals of glory. You'll see what I mean. First, we're going to look at Isaiah chapter 6, verse 3 to 5. Isaiah the prophet, and one called to one another and said, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, "Woe to me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." So this passage is a vision that the prophet Isaiah has in which he is getting to have a glimpse of the throne room of heaven. And so as he has this dream and has this vision, the angels and the seraphim are flying around, surrounding God. And what does he hear? The ground is shaking and the place is shaking. There's booming sounds and it's holy, holy, holy. The whole earth is full of his what? His glory. So what is Isaiah's response when he is in the presence of the fullness of God's glory? This is not a glimpse. This is the fullness of God's glory. He's there. What is his response? He wants to crawl into a hole and die. He says, "Woe is me." That basically means I am a dead man. I do not deserve to be breathing at this moment. I am so filthy. I want to die right now, seeing what I see. That was his response when he was in the fullness of God's glory. When we are confronted with God's glory like this, really, we are doomed. Another portrayal, Revelation chapter 1. This is John who was at the transfiguration. Years later, he writes this: "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. When he laid his right hand on me, saying, 'Fear not, for I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forever, and I have the keys of death and Hades.'" So this is John. He saw the transfiguration, and about 40, 50 years later, God gives to him a vision of what the last days will be like. And he's receiving this vision and he sees heaven, and he sees the fullness of God's glory in heaven. And what is his response? He writes, he fell at his feet, though dead, just like Isaiah. So in both of these passages, Isaiah and John both want to die when they see the fullness of God's glory. Now think about this. So in this transfiguration, Peter, James, and John are witnessing a glimpse of God's glory. But do they say, woe to me? Do they say I should drop dead right now? No, they act very differently. They were amazed. They were in awe. But their response was different. If they were to see the fullness of God's glory as Jesus unveils it, they would have died on that mountain. Jesus would not have taken them up there if he was going to reveal the fullness of his glory. But what I think is going on here is they are just receiving and seeing a fractional glimpse of God's glory. It's like Jesus is just taking off one button, and they're seeing this glory, and it's amazing to them. Just one little fractional glimpse, and it's just describing it with words that human words cannot describe. We cannot stand in his glory. It's just like in the Old Testament when the high priest would go in once a year to make sacrifices. You know what they did? They tied ropes around him. They put bells around his neck so that as he goes into the Holy of Holies, he's moving around, the bells are ringing. They know he's okay, but every once in a while, in the holiness and the glory of God there, that priest would be struck dead. And when the other priests listen, no more bells, oh boy, they pull him out. Because in that Holy of Holies rested the glory of God. So these portrayals of glory show us that we are so unable to approach God because of our sins. So what is our hope? Only someone like Jesus, who is glorious, can be our high priest and bring us into God's presence. Only someone like Jesus. So as you look at this passage, first, we see the person of glory, that's Jesus. Second, the prophets of glory who point to Jesus. Third, portrayals of glory that show we got no business being near Jesus, near God. But finally, we'll see how we become the people of glory. Look at verse 9. And as they were coming down from the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead might mean. So they're still a little confused. They're still putting it together. They're still figuring it out. And Jesus doesn't want them to start blabbering and just telling half-truths and things they don't understand yet. So he's like, just be quiet for a while. Just hold on to it. Just remember this. Now, I want us to remember a few things here. Remember how we mentioned Moses went up to the mountain to meet God. When Moses was on the mountain, he begged God, saying, remember, he's going to get the 10 Commandments, but he says, God, just show me your glory. I just want to see your glory. And he's begging God. And so God agrees. But God says, hey, I'm going to show you my glory, but you can't see it fully. Because if you see it, you're going to die. And so what does God do? He puts Moses into like a little hole in the rock. He stuffs him in there so that Moses can just see like a little crack. And then God says, I'm going to walk by, and you'll just see like my backside. You'll just see like a little glimpse of me. And so that's what happens. Moses is in there. He's looking out. He sees a little crack. God walks by, and boy, he sees a fractional bit of the glory of God. Now, what happens to Moses? He comes down from the mountain, and his face is radiant. His face is glowing. Why? Because that glory came to him. He saw it, and he's reflecting that glory. It's like sunburn. You got sunburn, your face changes. And then Moses is coming down the mountain, and his face is so white and so radiant. What do people do? There's not enough sunglasses to go around, so they come and they put veils on him. They cover his face because people can't look at his face because it's so bright. As time goes on, though, that glory that was on Moses' face, it faded away after a while. After he came down from the mountain, it faded away. Now, when Jesus here goes up on the mountain, he goes to show his disciples that he is God. So remember, Moses is reflecting God's glory like a mirror, and it fades away. But Jesus was shining and radiating glory that was inside of him. It was an inside to outside thing for Jesus. He was showing that this glory is not from elsewhere. I am the source of this glory, and he's showing that here to these disciples. And what's going to happen is very soon in this gospel story, in a couple Fridays, Jesus is going to go up to the mountain again. This time, he will not go up to the mountain with his friends and his disciples because they betray him as cowards. This time, he will go up to the mountain with his executioners. This time, he will go up to the mountain as the great high priest, where he will be the lamb and he will be sacrificed on our behalf on the altar of the cross. Why? To buy us glory. Why does he go up to the mountain of sacrifice? So that he can give us glory that we lost. All of our life, we are looking for glory. It's the glory that we lost in the garden. We try to find glory in everything in this world, in every person that we meet. But this world and people around us, it seems to offer glory, but it's fading. How many times have the things that you thought would bring you glory, it's great for a while, but it's fading? I want us to look at what John, remember, John is at the Transfiguration. John later wrote, "For God so loved the world." This is my son, for God so loved the world. John wrote Revelations. I felt like dying again. And then 1 John chapter 3, verse 2, he says, "Beloved," he's had many years to reflect on his life. 40, 50 years he's thought about it. "Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is." This is an amazing thing that John, at the Transfiguration, 50 years later, so he's writing this now. This is the doctrine of glorification. One day, we will see him. Remember, if we see him right now, we will die. We will be destroyed. But he's saying one day we will see him and his glory will not destroy us. John knows what it feels like to see a vision of heaven and feel like you should die. And he's saying one day we will see him. Because he's saying one day we will be made glorious just like him. Can you hear that again? One day we will be made glorious just like him. Not improved. We will be made glorious just like him. Because Jesus paid the price to make us glorious just like himself. If we look at this verse, we can just summarize it quickly in 4 statements. What John is saying here is, we are God's children. We are his children. He bought that for us with his glory. John is saying, we are declared glorious. It's not a if, it's not a maybe, but he's saying, because of Christ, we are declared glorious. But what he's also saying is we are becoming glorious. Declared glorious is our justification. We are becoming glorious. It's our sanctification. We are slowly becoming who we really are. We are slowly taking off that outer flesh, that outer costume of humanity. We're slowly taking it off, and we're slowly becoming who we really are inside. We still have it on. We're struggling to get it off. That costume, it's like stuck on us. We're trying to get it off. We're struggling with our sins. But slowly we are becoming glorious. And finally, we will see the fullness of His glory. Glorification. When we see Him face to face, we don't have to run and hide. We don't have to be in a rock. We don't have to dive into a hole and die. We can see Him face to face because we too will be glorious. Have you ever thought about it that way? You are not just getting rescued because you're drowning in sin. You're not just getting pulled out of the water and flown in a helicopter to the hospital. That's not just what salvation is. No, we are being made glorious. We are becoming as glorious as Jesus. And that's what we will be someday. So when we see Him, we will embrace Him in the fullness of His glory. This passage tells us there's a person of glory named Jesus. He is radiant. He shows us a glimpse of Himself in this world. We are prophets of glory, just like Moses and Elijah. Point to Him, point others to Him, but then fade away. Portrayals of glory reminds us that we got no business being in the presence of God. We got no business as sinners standing before a holy God. But the fact that now we're people of glory means that we are His children. We are declared glorious. We're becoming glorious. We will see the fullness of His glory someday. I hope that we leave this place thinking about how we are glorious. Can you just say that to yourself? God sees you and I as glorious, and He is making you what you are. He's slowly taking off that outer layer of humanity, and we will see Him one day, face to face. How glorious. Let's take a moment to pray.